During this demonstration, we are going to integrate with Microsoft Azure to deploy a Microsoft SQL Server. As you can see here in the workflow, we have a switch statement that we leverage in order to identify if the consumer provided a database server name or not. In case the consumer provided an existing server name, we first need to verify that this server name is actually up and running. It could have been demoted or removed through the management portal of Azure. Once we have that fact established that the server exists, we can then deploy a database and invoke the proper commands. If the consumer did not provide the server name, then we have to first create a database server. This database server will be available after a few minutes, so we need to verify that the server exists before we continue with further requests. Once the server is up and running, we invoke the call to create the database. At the end of the process, we retrieve information about the database that might be of interest for other workflows. How did we get to this point? If we want to integrate with Microsoft Azure, we need to adhere to certain certificates and security requirements. For this reason, we created a certificate on the HM Orchestrator side, published this certificate into the Azure Management Portal, and added this into a local Java key store. We provide this file in the module configuration, or the link to that file, as we are going to leverage this when we create the HTTP adapter request. Let's review this really quick on the Azure Management Portal. If you go into the Management Portal, you see that we have here our subscription ID that we need to leverage, and the database entries right now are all empty. We have no database deployed. The REST call to create the database requires for us to have the subscription ID. We just reviewed that subscription ID in the management side, so this is one portion that must be dynamically created for the URL. In addition, we have the server name, the database name, and the API version. Some of this information can be stored in the module configuration. Other information has to be computed during the execution of that workflow. In addition to the REST endpoint, we also need to create the header and the body. The body contains information about our database that we want to deploy and so forth. There are multiple REST calls that can be executed. At this point, we just leverage the create or update database REST calls. Now, if you go back to Development Studio and look at the workflow again, we see here create database server, right mouse click on this workflow, and we can now drill down on how we actually constructed that request. First of all, we retrieve some module configuration, assign the different versions, values, and so forth in order to populate our URL properly, and hand this over all in an XML construct called service data. Then we have an execute HTTP post wrapper workflow. Right mouse click and view process, and here you can see we have the compute post helper workflow that generates the body and the URL and so forth. Then we have a workflow to retrieve the associated adapter, and here we do not use the out-of-the-box HTTP adapter call, but we just use the activity call adapter because we generated the HTTP request appropriately with everything that is specific to Microsoft Azure. As we execute that HTTP REST call, we will have return data from Microsoft that contains an XML namespace information. For easier consumption of other workflows, we strip out the namespace and extract the data from the adapter response. The output of this will contain status information about the REST call, the messages that we receive back, and also a service result that usually contains information about the database server, the database itself, and the like. We keep these context items the same for all the workflows. That makes it easier for us when we want to create certain scenarios and drag and drop these workflows and automatically match context item. Let's see this workflow now in action. Create database. Execute. And as you can see here, only the database name is a mandatory field. The subscription ID can be overwritten, but as you learned from another workflow development video, we here ask not for all this data. If the consumer leaves these values empty, we assigned default values. So now we execute that process. The process finished all the way to the end. The output, our context items show that we have a proper return code, and the database result we see here, it was successfully deployed.